I'm Keelan. I get the privilege to introduce this month's Ecology Center seminar speaker. Dr. Hope Jahren, I keep saying it wrong, is currently a geobiologist at the University of Hawaii in their School of Ocean and Earth Science and Technology. She has also held professorial roles at Johns Hopkins University and Georgia Tech. She grew up in rural Minnesota and went to University of Minnesota, where she pursued her love of rocks and majored in geology. Freshly awarded the Bachelor of Arts, she immediately jumped into a PhD program and studied soil science at UC Berkeley. It was there that she learned her love of plants. Since then, she has coupled those two loves, rocks and plants, and finds opportunities to study plants in the fossil record to answer questions about how they've been making a living on Earth for the past 450 million years. I learned that today. She's active on Twitter. I put all of her digital presence up here. And she generally shares the wisdom she has gained from her 20 years of experience on a blog. The informal theme of that blog is women in academia, but topics range from how to talk about climate change to a tear-jerking post about what her adopted dog might be thinking. So for an opportunity to visit with Hope more after her talk tonight, the social is at Gino and Janice's house. The address is written up on the board over there. Her talk tonight is entitled Global Change in Your Dinner Plate. Please help me welcome Dr. Hope Jahren.
Thank you, Keelan. That was lovely. I don't think I've ever had a lovelier introduction, and I'm very grateful to you. I thank you very much for coming tonight. It is a cold night, and it's officially after 5 o'clock, and so I'm very grateful to you for showing up. I'm going to try to tell you some things that will be interesting to you. I know you probably hear a lot of talks about climate change, and you probably know a lot about food, but I'm going to try to tell you some things that might make you think in a different way or bring forward some things that maybe you haven't thought about lately. Who are my students or postdocs in the audience? Okay, what I'm really going to try to focus on today is to talk about how the world is different now, how we're living in a different world than we've had in the past, than the world that I grew up with, and the world that you will become scientists within and become members of the community within. Right, so I'm going to try to focus on some things that are new to our age, and so I'm really going to try to accentuate what this means for young people today. Right, so I'm going to talk about global change in your dinner plate. The punchline here is that global change is affecting the fundamental biology of how plants operate, and that is going to come to us many ways. One of the ways it's going to come to us real immediate is through our dinner plates. So let me tell you that story, and then you can tell me what you think. I want to emphasize that this is not my work alone. I'm going to tell you about stuff we've been doing for about 5 years of work we're going to talk about today. I'm Hope Jahren. I'm the professor. Bill Hagopian is the scientist who runs my lab. He was an undergraduate in the same lab that I was a graduate student about 25 years ago, and we've been working together ever since. Brian Schubert was the postdoc that was in charge of a lot of this work. Really smart guy. He's now a professor at the University of Louisiana. He's really a wonderful, just the kind of person you just feel grateful you got a chance to work with. Caleb King was a very hardworking technician. He's now a PhD student at UNC Chapel Hill. And Ben Check, you're going to look at some of his data. He was, my grad student just did a Herculean amount of work, just unbelievable, the amount of time and sweat he put into this project. He now works for a semi-nonprofit organization in the Midwest, working in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota, advising landowners and farmers on where to place wind turbines for maximum productivity of wind energy. So a lot of people in my lab have gone down many paths, and it's really been a joy to work with them. So I need to emphasize the fact that science is really a team effort, as always. Okay, so let's talk about today versus way back when. So here's 1950. Here's about where I was born. Here's about today, right? What you see here is a graph of global population, and you see that from 1950 up until more or less today, global population has about doubled. We're going to talk about the haves and the have-nots a little bit in this talk. One thing that is specific to your age is that we've got a greater disparity of riches or of even basic necessities than planet Earth has ever seen before. One of the great ironies of our age is that we are now living on an Earth where 1 billion people go to bed hungry every night. At the same time, another billion people wake up and commence eating themselves to death, right? That is a global problem that you will no doubt face in some capacity during your careers and during your lifetime. So if we look at the the richest countries, the most developed countries, about 1 billion people of that total, the very least developed countries, the very poorest, hungriest people, coming up to a point where nowadays that's about the same slice of the world. Let me show you a little more of that kind of data. So most of the data I'm going to show you comes from either the USDA, the FAO, the UN, or the World Bank. And feel free to come up to me later if you want to know where these statistics come from. I'm going to talk about the World Bank categories. So the World Bank has a way of dividing up income categories around the world to look at the relative disparities in wealth that we see around the globe. And they basically break up everybody on Earth into these 4 quartiles. Low-income nations, you've got an annual income per person, per capita, of about $1,000 or less, and that's in American dollars normalized to today's currency. So in order to fit into this category of what I'll keep referring to as the poorest, hungriest nations, about 1 billion people living on somewhere around $1,000 a year on average. So that's the average of that group. Much poorer and hungrier people within that distribution as well. High-income countries, these are the richest people in the world, the highest quartile, 1 billion people, again, living on about $12,000 a year, which doesn't sound like a lot of money. So you think about the United States, we're somewhere around $50,000 per capita, if you slice it up for everybody, a terribly rich nation, right? So in order to basically get into that high-income quartile, you basically become part of the world that's not constantly thinking about where the next meal is coming from. How will I feed my children? How will I shelter myself? What are the attributes of high-income rich nations? Well, the total population of people in that quartile is about 1.3 billion, about 1 billion people. The gross domestic product, so the value of all the goods and services produced in those nations, is about $50 trillion in 2013. Now, the value of goods and services is a somewhat flexible thing. I can spend 8 hours working. I can spend 8 hours making a hoodie to sell at Old Navy. I can spend 8 hours making an artificial heart valve to put into a person at the Mayo Hospital. If I spend 8 hours on that heart valve, I'm going to make a product that's worth a lot more money than if I make a hoodie for Old Navy, right? So we've got people working every day all over the world, but the value of the goods and services produced in rich countries are simply valued more highly. For whatever reason, those values can change. So the gross domestic product in rich nations is about 50 trillion for all of them put together. The gross national income per person, if that was distributed fairly, which of course it never is about 39,000 in 2013. About 80% of people in rich nations live in urban centers, and that's important because urban centers tend to provide better health care, provide better education, particularly for both sexes, and also provide better voting opportunities, ways to participate in social and political life. This is also important. CO2 emissions per person is about 11.6 metric tons, and again, that's in the year 2013. Rich nations represent about 18% of the global population, so certainly a minority, but about 1 billion people. That's the part of the planet that really is secure in where their next meal is coming from. Where are they located geographically? Well, where you might be familiar with. So here in the United States where we live, we are officially part of the rich part of the world. Europe, we look at some of the wealthier Middle Eastern countries. We look at Japan, Australia, etc. So there's a geographic specificity to these patterns. Let's look at the very poorest nations and compare those patterns. So today, in those poor nations, we've got almost 1 billion people. So I generalize and say we've got 1 billion very rich, we've got 1 billion very poor and hungry. The gross national income per person on average is about $664. So in today's international money, trying to make a go of it on about $2 a day is the average state of affairs within that sector. The gross domestic product is about 500 billion. So compare that to the many orders of magnitude more gross domestic product we're seeing in the rich nations. Just the work that is done within rich countries is valued as better work that's worth more. And that's what propagates these patterns. Only 29% of people within this sector live in urban centers. And of course, that has ramifications for agriculture, but it has definite ramifications for schooling, especially for small children, for health care, for maternal health care, for social and political participation. This is also important. CO2 emissions from these places are absolutely minute compared to the rich countries. So this is another thing that's very specific to our age, and you will see that a little bit more. But the countries that are producing CO2 and triggering climate change are not the same countries that are suffering from the effects, that are picking up the pieces from global disruption. There's a big offset between those two phenomena. And people within these poor, hungry nations represent about 12% of the population. And where are they distributed? You see that an awful lot of these folks live in sub-Saharan Africa, Bangladesh, parts of India. Afghanistan has been a consistently very poor nation, North Korea, and also around Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So there are definite geographic patterns to where this happens. Things are changing. Let's go back to how things are changing now. Global population has more than doubled since 1960, but grain production has more than tripled. And we sometimes call this the green revolution, is that even though global population has increased dramatically, our ability to produce food, mainly in terms of grain, has also increased quite a bit. This is for two reasons. One reason is that we're simply farming more land. Land has been cleared in South America. Land has been cleared also in the United States. Places have been turned over to farming. We're farming more land than we ever have before. The other big reason is that the yield are increasing for each of these three main crops. The amount of food that we can get out of each square meter has increased dramatically for each of those types, and it's kind of leveled off for rice and wheat, but it is still increasing for corn. And you'll notice that that shows in the graph. So grains are super important. Corn, rice, wheat, three big grains constitute about 2/3 of the world's food supply. These three plants. These grains are also very critical for feeding animals, which then produce meat, eggs, and milk. For the part of the world that is able to take in energy through protein and fat that were derived from animal sources, right? And in fact, in the United States, most of the grain that we grow goes to feeding animals, which we then access as food. So getting back to plants, I think one thing we forget sometimes is that food always comes back to a plant, whether we eat the plant directly or we eat an animal that fed off of a plant. And I started out interested in plants. Does anybody know where this picture is? Any guesses? That's Central Park, right. So that is looking down toward Midtown from the Upper West Side. All you're supposed to get out of this picture is it's kind of neat, but it also shows that a world with plants is really different than a world without plants. I got interested in plants because they're such an unusual life form. I would submit to you that they're the most successful and spectacular life form that the planet has. So land was colonized about 450 million years ago, and plants have been around on the surface ever since. We don't have plant dinosaurs. So we had mosses then, we have mosses now. We had ferns then, we have ferns now. So the earth is kind of filling and refilling and more overfilling with plants with a continual colonization cycle. We don't have big extinctions where we lose things the same way we do with dinosaurs. Plants are very large organisms. They're very long-lived organisms. They are arguably the most successful organisms on the surface of the terrestrial Earth. It's very common for you to walk down the street and meet a plant that has been alive for a couple hundred years and weighs a ton. We don't find that as a common entity within the animal world. Also, I work on land. I don't work in the ocean. I always like to pass this on when I have the attention of students. You and I are more closely related to a tree than a tree is to a plankton in the ocean, right? So the entity of the plant on land is very different than the plant in the ocean. The average plant in the ocean is 1 cell big. It lives for about 20 days. The average plant on land can be a ton and live for about 200 years. Totally different life forms. So let's talk more about plants on Earth. One thing that plants have evolved into is a source of food for animals and a source of food for human beings. What I find is that people notice plants, but they don't really see them. I like to bring this home a little bit. This is looking across ecosystem types. If we compare the amount of biomass that are in plants to the amount that are in animals across different biomes, you see that plants vastly outmass animals in every single ecosystem. And in fact, in the boreal forests and the conifer forests, we see that that ratio is well up into the thousands. And even in places like deserts, grasslands are funny because you don't get trees. You don't get anything that's got any height. A grassland is kind of a constricted plant community. But we see that those values, even in grasslands, deserts, and places like that, are in the hundreds, up to 1,000, right? So really what we have as a life form on planet Earth are plants. This is how I got interested in them. Another thing I like to point out when I've got people's attention is that anytime you look at a plant, you're really only seeing about 40 to 60% of it. So you walk around, and hopefully you'll do this after this talk. You look around and you'll say, wow, there's a lot of plants out there. I really am outnumbered and outmassed to an incredible level. Then think to yourself, I'm only seeing half of these organisms. I'm only seeing these guys from the waist up. We're going to talk a little bit more in this talk about what's happening underground, because there's a whole lot of life going on that is affected by particularly global change. So what is a plant? So I'm interested in, so everything on planet Earth is basically trying to solve the same problem. In order to persist as a species through the long term, you've got to do 5 things well. You've got to grow, you've got to maintain that growth, you've got to store resources, you've got to defend our tissues, and eventually we've got to reproduce in order to keep going on planet Earth. And plants have a very special way of solving each one of those problems. As animals, we solve these problems by, when we want resources, we run out and get them. We spend a lot of time moving around and chasing resources and getting them. We spend a lot of energy doing that, and so we have high energy needs. Plants very different. It stays in one place, never moves. We also have the capability to run away from things that threaten us. When it gets cold outside, we come inside. When it gets dangerous at a certain place, we walk away from it. Plants, again, stay in one place. They have to be able to respond and defend against whatever comes their way for sometimes several hundred years. And despite all these differences, they grow to be several tons large and persist and thrive for hundreds of years. Another way in which they're interestingly different than us is that we have generally few offspring, but we have very good success rates for our offspring. The oak tree in your backyard might have 10,000. Some years it might, if it's a big one, it might have 100,000 seeds that it makes. Fertile offspring, right? But the fact that less than 1% of those might germinate, and less than 1% of the ones that do germinate are going to make it past that first or second year. So incredibly low success rates. Nevertheless, a huge bunch of reproductive activity. So there are some really fundamentally different approaches that plants have versus animals. And I really enjoy thinking about those things and thinking about how it matters through time. That's how I got into this. So let me teach you a little bit about what plants do. So this is a radish, but it could be an oak tree. It could be poison ivy. could be a bamboo stand. All plants, all the things I'm going to tell you are generalities. All plants work basically the same way. A plant is specialized into its above ground tissues and its below ground tissues. The above ground tissues are adapted toward gaining the resources carbon dioxide and light, which it uses for energy. That's the energy sources, light and CO2. Its carbon comes in through the leaves. Carbon never, ever, ever comes up into the plant through the soil. I sometimes meet students that are confused on that point, so I like to clarify. CO2 makes its carbon tissues, comes in from the atmosphere. The below ground tissues are adapted towards gaining water and, importantly, gaining all the things that come solubilized inside that water. Nitrogen we need for every protein we build. Phosphorus we need for ATP. And then all the different metals that will act as catalysts within our enzymes, etc. So that's basically how a plant operates. The way CO2 gets into a plant is through something called a stomate. And it's basically a little hole on the underside of the leaf, and it's protected by two little guard cells. And they're basically two cells side by side, and when that hole is shut, when the door shuts, the plant hydrates those cells, and when it wants to open that stomate, it dehydrates those cells, right, into an opening. A plant has individual control over every single stomate on its organism at any given time. There's also a great deal of specific control over how many stomates will be engineered into every single leaf, right? So there is actually, people look at me funny when I say this, but there's a real decision-making process that goes on. It's not the same decision-making process you and I engage in, but in order to interact with the environment, this is the main mechanism by which plants do it. They can open or close their stomata, and in that way they can let out water or let in CO2. When you can't run away, that's your main way of interacting with the world. It gets important because CO2 is a resource for plants, right? That's where they get their carbon. They don't get it anywhere else. And CO2, a main resource, is changing quite a bit over our lifetimes and will change much more, it's very likely, over the rest of yours. So this is data actually from Hawaii. This is called the Keeling plot. Again, we've got 1960 up to about today. This is the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, so the concentration, sometimes called parts per million. You've probably heard this. We started out at the Industrial Revolution down below 300, and the burning of fossil fuels as well as the turning up of Earth for agricultural processes has led to this value increasing and increasing through time. Today, we're actually just about right at 400. And so this is a little bit like, with my classes, I use some clumsy analogies, but the best one I have for this is that CO2 is like money for plants. So if I doubled everybody's salary in this room, it would change your activities, right? Very few of you would continue to live exactly the same life if you were making double the amount of money. But you would all probably do something different with that money. And what you decide to do with it is going to be a combination of several things. It's going to be based on your needs, your wants. You might gamble it. You might make bad decisions. You might be responding to alleviate some kind of stress that you're under. You might pay off your debts, etc. And you might innovate. You might try something new that you'd never thought of trying before. We're going to see each of those chances or each of those approaches taken across the plant communities that we know today. And the ramifications of making those different decisions is going to be particularly important within the crops that we grow, is my basic argument. So how's that going to work? I got interested in this because I started out in geology, and I'm really interested in long patterns over evolution. I'm interested in why do we have plants? Why do they run the world when so many of the things that they do seem a little bit compromised compared to making a go of it as an animal? Here's an interesting plot where we talk about the volume of basalt that's created. This is basically a proxy for how many volcanoes were going off. There was a period in the last couple 100 million years where there was massive volcanic activity. For example, all of India is almost essentially one basalt flow. What's interesting thing about this that we noticed right away is that there are some key innovations in plant evolution, particularly the emergence of flowers, which is a relatively new innovation, that is tightly coupled with some very high levels of volcanic activity. So the idea that CO2 changes might be important in terms of spurring new plant activities is not new, and it's something we've been involved in for a while. So this is a little complicated, but I'm going to walk you through it. So PCO2, this is a little bit of PCO2 in the atmosphere, actually none, all the way up to an awful lot. And so this is a bar graph. So pre-industrial, before the Industrial Revolution, before we had engines, before we burned coal, gasoline, etc., this value was about at 270. In 2009, the current level was about 389. Right now, we're sitting at right about 400. In the early 90s, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it was an international group that put together a study that tried to project how CO2 levels were going to increase. It used several different scenarios based on population growth, energy source, etc. Some of the scenarios were very optimistic. We would come up with a non-fossil fuel source of energy, or we'd become much better at conserving. And some were more pessimistic, or actually more realistic in terms of increasing, greatly increasing population and greatly increasing fuel use. So the low estimate for 2100 came out at about 550, and the high estimate came out at about 970. At this point, there was an absolute fury within the plant ecology community to look at what was the effect of 550 ppm on plant growth. So the idea that enhanced CO2 would affect plant growth is not new with me. Ecologists have been studying this furiously since the early 90s, and literally there are hundreds of review papers reviewing thousands of studies on CO2 fertilization in plants. So the work I'm showing you is not special because it deals with CO2. The work we did was special because of the levels that we used. We used experiments that worked up to and between these levels of blue. So the very high for 2100 is here. The previous growth experiments went at the highest up to 750, and I'll show you some data for that one. But we were interested in values that were associated with the time of the dinosaurs, the time when India was being spilled out in these massive volcanic eruptions. And so we did some plant growth experiments that took us clear all the way up to 4200, and we saw some very interesting things. What did the plant ecologists get when they did those 550 experiments? Well, the response was pretty standard. So I just talked about CO2 as money. We can talk about CO2 as food. It's the basic resource for plants. If I double the amount of food that you have on your plate every single day, Keeling, what will happen to your biomass? It will go up. And lo and behold, this is what ecologists have seen. So in these conifer communities, at 550, we see about a 30% increase. I can show you all the citations for this if you wish. And soybean fields, 30 to 40. Grasses, a lot of crops are in that group. 30 to 40, a lot of grains. And things like walnut, poison ivy, herbs, things like that, around 40. So there's a lot of consensus around the fact that at 550 we can expect an increase in plant biomass. We were interested in higher levels basically because I think like a tree. 2050, that's not far enough away. I want to know what things are going to be like 200 years from now, 300 years from now, my great-great-great-grandchildren's time. Right? So if we look at the projections, and again, this gray is the IPCC. So here's real data. This has actually already happened. Here are projections. The gray is the IPCC. You see the So you see the really really optimistic estimate, and you see the more realistic one. And recently, out of University of Maryland, there's a very long-term projection takes into account population growth, and it takes into account peak oil and fluctuating oil prices as well, which is kind of interesting. So again, this isn't data, these are projections, but based on scholarship, there's reason to do experiments at this level. Because remember, the ecologists have only really studied at 550. In our great-great-grandchildren's age, we could easily be looking at a world that's somewhere around 1800. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to show you data that comes from experiments that deal with those levels. So what have we been doing for the last 5 years? Well, some of what we've been doing is growing plants under controlled PCO2 to those very high levels. We've grown 7 species now. We've grown a total of almost 400 plants, and I'm going to show you a lot of different data. First, I'm going to show you data from Raphanus and also Arabidopsis. This is just the reason why we chose these species. Arabidopsis is known for its genome. Raphanus is known for its partitioning models, and that will become important in a minute. How do we do this? What we basically do in my lab is we grow very high-tech gardens. We have these sort of plexiglass boxes, and they operate under positive pressure, and we can control CO2, relative humidity, various gas flux, water availability, light level, and of course, water delivery system, and also nutrients on a minute-to-minute level. And we grow plants and see what they look like in terms of their biomass and other attributes. We've experimented with growing some larger ones, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. The larger the chamber, the more slop there is on controlling the conditions. So we're constantly making this negotiation between having a realistic scenario for crops particularly and having real fine-tuned control so we can see, again, we want to zero in on CO2. What is the effect of CO2? I want to show you some movies of these guys. Another thing that we do is we take time-lapse photography of a lot of the plants that we grow. And I like to show this simply because these are day by day. Simply because I think they're neat, and I also think it brings home the fact that plants are more animated. They're actually alive. They don't do things on the same time frame that we do, and so we see them as rather inanimate. But they actually do many of the same range of motion things that you find yourself doing each day. Inside these chambers, there's no wind. They're plexiglass chambers. And so what you're seeing is, again, those stomate opening and closing, which allows the water turgor pressure to increase and decrease, which allows the plant stems to stiffen and relax. And it allows the plant to jockey around and try to find the best sun spot and to compete with its neighbors and all kinds of things. So the plants are doing this deliberately for reasons, I would argue. So this is just a day of growth. Okay, so that was a day of growth. Every single one of those plants, I promise you, was given exactly the same amount of water and nutrients and given the chance to obtain the same amount of light. And you saw all that movement was them competing with each other, them trying to jockey for resources within a closed space. It turns out, if you want to, you can move your arm 90 degrees from here to here. If a plant needs to, it can move its leaf. One of those guys needs to move its leaf from here to here, 90 degrees. You can just do it 10,000 times faster than the plant can, right? So in some ways, we're sort of trapped in different time frames, and that, I think, is a really interesting way to think about plants. So again, this is what we do. We grow them. These are some of the first ones that we built. We engineered all of these just from stuff at Home Depot. And elsewhere. We can control growth stage, nutrient supply, water, relative humidity, nitrogen, phosphorus, light, intensity, duration. And of course, we can vary PCO2 across almost a full order of magnitude. what happens when we do this? So there is a study that went up above 550. So here's 550. So this is PCO2. And this is Hunt in Functional Ecology 1991. It was a really landmark study very soon after the IPCC result. Looked at, I think it was 23 different herbs, and looked at the fertilization effect across not just 550, but up to 750. And that's important because when you do an experiment where you have ambient and elevated, you can draw a line through those points. Well, biological systems don't behave in a linear way, right? I can't keep increasing Keelan's dinner plate until she's as big as Tyrannosaurus Rex, right? It's not linear, right? At some point, it'll level off and become a hyperbola, right? At some point, something else will become limiting, or just her genetic blueprint will become limiting. She can't go on forever. So what you can do once you have more than one point is try to approximate that hyperbola. And what we wanted to do is take Hunt's study and say, what's the hyperbola you draw if all you know is what's happening down here? And what's the hyperbola you draw if you actually do the experiments at those higher levels? So let me show you the difference. So that's what you get if you mathematically project out Hunt's data. And here's what we saw in our experiments. So this is Raphanus. So what you see here is that the total biomass of this plant, the whole plant, hit somewhere higher than what Hunt did, although it followed Hunt pretty well at his levels. And that makes me argue that actually it doesn't level off down where you'd think it might, but it just keeps going. This fertilization effect just picks up and keeps going. The interesting thing about this is partitioning. So this is the total biomass, but this is how it shakes out. The above ground biomass has a much lower fertilization rate than the below ground biomass. So as the plants are getting bigger, they're preferentially shunting that tissue below ground, which has all kinds of ramifications. So again, and I'm picking on Keelan because I know she'll let me, right? Okay, so we're going to triple everything I put on your plate every single day. And you agreed with me already that your biomass will, okay, your necktie size and your belt size, which one will increase more? Right. So you're going to have morphological specificity to how you increase based on the availability of storage associated with your different organs. What we believe is that the first product of photosynthesis is sugar, and the natural place to store sugars is below ground. So this is how photosynthesis works. This is CO2. It's fixed by the rubisco enzyme into a 3-carbon sugar. This is 3C plants. And it ends up as a 3-carbon intermediate, and it ends up as a sugar, and then this sugar accumulates into below ground tissue. That's what we think the chemical mechanism is. And I can tell you why CO2 has anything to do with that if you're interested in the biochemistry as well. So what's going on? We'd like to know more about that photosynthetic mechanism. We'd like to know more about, okay, so Keelan got bigger, but we'd like to know more about how this is affecting her health, how this is affecting her as an organism. We're going to attack this in a few different ways. We're going to look at RNA, and we're going to look at secondary metabolites. And it works a little bit like this. If I walk into your office and I want to know what you do all day, right? I can get a reasonably good idea by looking at your computer. I can look at your hard drive to see what kind of capacity you have, to see what you're capable of. And that's the DNA of my plant. I'm using Arabidopsis because I know its genome. I know what it's capable of. I can look and see what software you've got open. You've got Facebook open, or do you have MS Word open, right? That gives me a clue into what you spend your time doing. And that's messenger RNA. And that's something that we measured the up versus down regulation of. And I'll show you that. I can also see what's coming out of your printer, right? And that's, you might have both Facebook and MS Word open, but it depends. But what comes out of your printer tells me a lot about what you're actually doing, right? And those are the secondary metabolites. I'm going to show you that data as well. So what is this Arabidopsis stuff doing? I've got all kinds of data here, but let me show you the most interesting stuff. So this is control, higher, higher, and highest. Control, higher, higher, and highest. What you see here is sucrose. Sucrose is something only a plant can make. No other organism in the world besides a land plant can make and accumulate sucrose. Sucrose values are going way up as CO2 enriches. And glycine, that's a precursor for proteins. It's a very important precursor for proteins in plants. Soybeans are called glycine max, actually, right? Glycine is going way down. So just because this plant is getting bigger, it's changing its orientation. So maybe Keelan didn't build a whole bunch of muscle when I quadrupled her dessert supply. Maybe she built a different kind of tissue instead, right? And we're seeing that in our plant, which is doing a lot more sugar and potentially a lot less protein. That's important for crops. Here's genes, and this is a little bit of a complicated plot, but we've got blue data and red data. You see a lot more red or a lot more blue? Red, okay, you got it. Right, exactly. So these are different genes that we tested the regulation of with messenger RNA. This is a little bit like seeing what software is running on your desktop. What I'm showing you here is this is a little bit elevated, very elevated, highly elevated relative to ambient. So what I'm showing you is that the genes associated with these activities are all down-regulated. The plant is shutting off all its software as CO2 goes up. And this is important. These plants, as CO2 goes up, are less able to deal with stress. They're less able to defend themselves against pathogen attack. They are less able to grow and repair themselves. They reproduce much earlier, but definitely energy functions, transport, and then a whole lot of things that we haven't yet been able to precisely pinpoint are all shutting down. The plant it's a little bit like, do you have a Costco here or Sam's Club? Yeah, I call this the Costco effect. So if you buy your toilet paper at Costco and you have 400 rolls in your bathroom closet, you're going to use toilet paper a lot differently day after day if you've only got one roll in there and it's a 5-mile walk down to the store to get another one, right? And this is basically what the plants are doing. Why defend a leaf against fungi, against pathogens, etc., if there's so much carbon in the environment that you can just grow another one when you get tired of it? Right? And that has big implications for how well our crops are going to be able to defend themselves against pathogens, how much herbicide they're going to need, how much fertilizer is going to be required to stimulate growth, etc. We think that's a really big deal. One more thing I want to say about this. We talked about rice, wheat, and corn. Anybody ever grown any of those as a farmer or as a gardener? I know you have. The part you eat, rice, wheat, and corn, where is it? Above ground, right? Right. So if we do get this bump, if we have all these hungry people on Earth and we do get this bump from CO2, and you hear a lot about how CO2 is good for plants and it will result in more biomass, and that's true, very true. If we do get this bump, is it smart for all of us to be so reliant on crops that produce the edible biomass above ground? That's worth thinking about. And that brings me to the next part of the talk. I'm going to talk about a bunch of experiments that we did on sweet potato. Because there's an awful lot of people in the world that get a decent amount of their nutrition from sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes and yams and, to a lesser extent, common white potatoes. They're cultivated in over 100 developing countries. They are 7th in production throughout Middle Africa, so they're a very important crop in some of the hungriest nations of the world. Ethiopia, for example, one of the very hungriest nations in the world, 50% of the GDP associated with agriculture is based on yam production. Staple food, we also looked at it because it's very important in Hawaiian and Micronesian traditional diets. Sweet potatoes, below ground growth is great because it's high yielding, it's drought tolerant, and it has a wide adaptability. You don't have to, the soil kind of stores the food for you while it grows. So it's a good option. Sweet potatoes and below ground crops actually produce more edible energy per hectare than white rice, wheat, or cassava. And they are also much more rich in vitamins and minerals than some of their refined counterparts. And the leaves are rich in protein. We don't eat the leaves ourselves, but there are many cultures, and particularly in very hungry nations, where a great deal of your protein might come from sweet potatoes or from the leaves associated with them. So we wanted to know what very high levels of CO2 will do to this particular crop. This is a sweet potato planted using traditional Hawaiian means on the island of Oahu, and you can see it's planted in these kind of mounds. And this is a very low fertility soil, and it's not even a particularly wet place, but you can make a go of it with sweet potatoes as a good option. You see bananas growing back there and sort of a mixed agriculture. Let's talk about climate vulnerability. So this is a paper came out in Nature by Sampson et al. In 2011, and it puts together a whole lot of variabilities, salt incursion, changes in water, population growth, malaria risk, etc., and tries to come up with this general climate vulnerability index. And what you basically see are that the poorer, hungrier portions of the world are at greater risk for destabilization with what we think are going to be drying trends and sea level rise, etc. What I want to, and we can, this isn't my research, we can argue about this, etc., but what I want to show you is that there's a great deal of overlap here with the three regions that are very heavily dependent on sweet potatoes, right? So this is the geographic distribution of sweet potato harvested area. These blue, green, etc. are the higher amounts. What you see here is China. Tremendous amount of sweet potatoes grown in China, all used to feed pigs, almost exclusively used as pig feed. We can also look at the relative suffering in those parts of the world. So let me draw lines around those same areas where sweet potatoes are very much depended upon. We can look at stunted growth among children less than 5 years old, which is a good indicator of chronic malnutrition. And you see that that kind of suffering maps very closely onto places that would be very vulnerable if something were to be modulated with respect to sweet potato growth. Okay, so I've just tried to show you that this is worth studying, and we thought it was, and we put a lot of effort into this. There's greenhouses up in Hawaii. Hawaii is great if you like to grow plants. It's basically a greenhouse out in the middle of the ocean. We grow plants all year. We don't have winter like you do here. And so it's a great thing because I can require people to work every damn day of the year, year after year. Yeah, okay, so we have this greenhouse, which actually has a screened-in roof. It's not glassed in, and it's just up the valley from us, and there's almost always a rainbow or two that crown the place. And we built these kind of greenhouse things within the greenhouse, right? So we've got our growth chambers within the greenhouse. This little blue tent is where my graduate student, that's where Ben lived for 12 weeks. As he monitored these guys. You think that's a joke? It's not a joke. So these guys, the lights are on about 12 hours a day, and a lot of the measurements that we do in setting things up have to be done before the sun comes up. And then a lot of the measurements we do about growth that day happen after the sun goes down. And then the real-time monitoring of the thing takes place every 10 minutes while the thing's growing, right? And so this guy, honestly, he lived up there for 12 weeks. He did it twice because the first experiment went south. Okay, so here he is working with the tensiometers. We controlled the soil moisture as best we could. We had about 32 plants per chamber. At the harvest, he separated into fine roots and large roots. He did all kinds of morphometric analyses, and he also did nutritional analyses. As you've learned at the grocery store, bigger is not always better. You go buy a tomato, you just grab the biggest one, you might not get the best one, and you know that already. So we'd like to know what's happening nutritionally as well. Monitored these daily. There was a stringent pest control. There he is dealing with pests. During the course of the day, he examined each leaf on each one of these plants and hand-picked off any mites that he found during the course of the experiment. 12 weeks. Okay, finally at the end of all this, he harvested. He had an awful lot of help from the other people in my lab as well, of course, and ended up harvesting all the sweet potatoes, massing them for, again, not just mass, but their root permeability, all kinds of different indices. But I'm going to show you the interesting stuff that we saw with respect to nutritional trends. Biomass assessment. So when we talk about biomass, how do we characterize this? You heard me, I'm not going to belabor this, but you heard me talk about a hyperbola, right? This response that saturates out. And what we wanted to do was describe this mathematically and then compare responsiveness according to one of the mathematical indices. So this variable B basically shows us how responsive this is to CO2, the shape of the hyperbola, sort of how steep it is. Right? So that's 57% growth with a B value. So we can get the same total growth. See how these two curves have the same total growth? But they have different responsiveness to the CO2. And that's what we're really interested in, is to what extent are the responsive mechanisms being triggered when that CO2 is put in. High responsiveness, so we get a lot of action as CO2 changes. Is that moving? High responsiveness is a lower B value. Lower responsiveness is a higher B value. That's all you need to remember in terms of what I'm going to show you now. Here's one important thing that we learned. And we also have a lot of results associated with this. He did a sub-experiment where he compared conventional agriculture. Most of this, we had fertilized these guys. We gave them enough water. We wanted them to be happy. We wanted to zero in on exactly what the CO2 was doing, right? And if we knew it wasn't happy for some other reason, we couldn't attribute to that to CO2, right? So we were very careful to just isolate CO2. But in some experiments, he did compare conventional agriculture, conventional fertilizer to organic fertilizer. So that was a dung-based slurry that he put onto those. What you see here is that the conventional response above ground was about the same as organic as CO2 rose. But below ground, in those storage roots of the sweet potatoes, the conventional response was way, way higher than that organic response. And that brings out another point, is that if we want to take advantage of this CO2 effect, we're going to need to be able to keep up with fertilizer and also with water in each of these places. And quite frankly, an organic approach to that is probably not going to give us the yield that we need to do this on a very large scale. So the B values above ground, you see they're about the same, but below ground, you see the conventional and the organic diverge quite a bit. Moreover, those A values were quite different above and below ground. Okay, so let's look at what I'm going to try to convince you of is that we needed to do this study. So all the different root crops that had been done at lower CO2, do you get the same thing if you go up to our high levels? And here we go. So our responsiveness was this B value of about 0.09. And you see all the other studies had come up with much higher B values, which is much lower responsiveness. So again, that's based on drawing the hyperbola out from what they did, as opposed to actually measuring it the way we did. The same kind of pattern that says, again, the punchline is if you go up to those very high levels, the effect doesn't level off. It just keeps going. We saw that for Arabidopsis. We also saw it for the sweet potatoes. Nutritional analysis. So let's get to the nutritional part. So we did an awful lot, or Ben did an awful lot of lab work on every single one of those potatoes to analyze its nutritional content. And he did it in replicate. Okay, so here's the punchline. In terms of carbohydrates, we saw increases, but they were significant in terms of the total carbohydrates. The fiber and the sugars also increased, but not as a statistically significant phenomenon. We also saw decreases. As these guys got bigger, they also decreased dramatically in terms of their protein content and in terms of their mineral content, things like magnesium, iron, calcium, potassium, etc. And also fat content, not as significant, but somewhat lower. You don't think about gaining fat as a nutrient from a sweet potato, but if you're in a particularly hungry part of the world, you might be rather dependent on them for certainly protein and maybe even fat. We can look at those minerals kind of one by one and across the board: phosphorus, magnesium, manganese, important things like calcium and iron, all much lower as we go up to those higher CO2 concentrations. And we can talk later about the biochemistry if you're interested in that. We have some theories about exactly where the cycle is disrupted. So this is a really neat graph that we made. This is a nutrition label that you would stick on a sweet potato. This is the one you're going to stick on the sweet potato at 763. Here's 1100, and here's 1500, right? So as we increase CO2, this is how the nutrition content of these guys changes. Green is increase, red is decrease. So the total nutrient density score, and that's just an index that is calculated for every given food based on a variety of attributes. The nutrient density score actually goes down as these things get bigger and bigger. The total carbohydrates go up and the sugar content goes up, but look, the protein content's going down, and then all the different vitamins and minerals that you might be getting from this are going down. Our suggestion, or what we want to start talking about, is that it's not too early to start experimenting with engineering new breeds of sweet potato that can better take advantage of nutrient compositions, of nutrient additions within the soil, etc. We need to start thinking about how to make these guys more nutritious as CO2 inevitably continues to rise and we start to see these effects on plant biology. I just have basically one more slide for you, and that's, remember we looked at this at the beginning, we looked at 1950 and we looked at today. Let's look at the United Nations projection, and of course this is the future. Nobody really knows what the future will hold, but this is the best guess of a research group based on changing infant mortality, based on changing maternal mortality, nutrition, disease, population growth, etc. And the conservative estimate is that by 2100, we might be dealing with a world where it's our foremost responsibility to feed and shelter upwards of 10 billion people. And this, right now we're sort of neck and neck between the very hungriest and the very richest, but under this model, we might be looking at 2 or even close to 3 billion terribly hungry people, maybe double the number that are able to live at the standard that we enjoy here in the United States. The other thing that we might see under this scenario is 1,000 ppm or 1,500 ppm in terms of CO2, right? So we need to start thinking about these things now and be proactive. How we look at our food supply, what we're growing, number one, and how we're delivering nutrients to what we're growing, and how we're breeding the potential target crops for a world that looks very high population and also very high CO2. One last thing I want to leave you with, and let's go back to today's world, is that, how much food do we need to eat? The USDA recommends, this is a dietary recommendation, that we eat somewhere between 2,100 and 2,700 calories per day, right? The average American eats well more than that, and in those richest countries, we're eating well over 3,000 calories a day. The United Nations sets minimum consumption to sustain life. When calorie requirements go below this, it's officially considered a famine in terms of UN estimations, and that's set at 1,800 calories per day, right? So if we look at who's eating what all over the globe, and we took all the calories that are consumed nowadays, eating meat, eating everything we eat now, if we divided it up equitably, we could have a world where every single person is getting 2,800 calories per day. So it's not that we have too many people for our food system. It's that we haven't figured out a way to share the way we should. And this is going to be a really big issue for for the young people here. This is going to be one of the big issues that you will hear about over the next decades. And I like to suggest that this is still a problem that is within our grasp. We're really good at growing food. We're really good at engineering food. And this is going to be a great area for young people to get excited about and to move into some good problem solving towards. So hopefully I've been able to interest you with what we've done toward this, spark your imagination. I would be delighted to take questions. Yes. Yes, it does. It's well mixed on the order of an entire year, but there's certainly a seasonal effect associated with where vegetation is dense. So there are fluctuations locally, but on the time scale of a year, it mixes out. Yeah. I'm sorry? Yeah, the regulation? Yeah.
And I wonder whether things that deal with stressors, anti-stress out.
Right, exactly.
Would that be a reason why it's been 100%?
Right. So what was
Can you repeat the question?
Right. Okay. So she said the question is basically that these guys were under luxury consumption. They weren't stressed out. How would these experiments been different if we had also applied nutrient stress or water stress or something along those lines? Is basically where you're coming from. Yeah, or mines. Yeah. Right. Exactly. We actually have a big grant to work on that in the next several years. Primarily water stress, because water is going to be a big commodity in the next 100 or 200 years, and getting water to the places where we need it to do agriculture is going to be the main thing. That's our next thing to tackle, basically, is how do you map water stress onto all of this? What do I think will happen? I'm not going to. You'll have to have me back in a couple of years to tell you the answer. I'm not going to speculate. Yes. Yes.
I had a question about some of your statistics. So when you had the nutrition labels that showed the amounts of metals and proteins and such decreasing per serving size, were they staying constant per plant unit, as a single plant? Because I know the serving size
those are all per mass basis.
Yeah, per mass basis they're decreasing because the plant size was increasing due to this increase in CO2, but the amount of nutrients per plant was the same?
Well, I mean, you could compare, this potato in your hand versus this potato in your hand, right? But you're always going to have that across. You've got big variability at all levels, is kind of where that comes from. So it's basically a bite per bite level. So if you take a 1 gram bite of this guy versus a 1 gram bite of that guy, what is the different nutrients that you're getting? So serving size doesn't change across this.
Well, yeah, I was curious about serving size as compared to plant.
Right. So does yield? So what does get to your question is so there are different marketabilities for these guys. So if they approach a certain size, then the marketability changes, right? You see the ones at your grocery store and they're all of about the same kind of size. We didn't actually see a big change in distribution in terms of how these things would be marked for your grocery store. If that gets to what you're saying.
I'm not sure if it does.
So they're all still roughly the same size. You weren't getting huge variability in the size of one individual.
We didn't measure
You had a lot more carbohydrate that was still.
That was diluting and diluting, exactly. That seemed to be what I was getting at.
Sorry, we can come back to that.
Okay.
Yeah. Did we measure beta carotene? We did not measure beta carotene. This particular strain of sweet potato is not as important for that as some others. So I think we would want to tweak the experiment a little bit to get to those active organic vitamins. We mostly focused on the inorganic minerals simply because they were easier to measure at first pass. Yes.
Do you see any potential role for evolution in all this? Because, when you're ramping up CO2 to super high, so those first two experiments you did, ppms are like up in the 1400 range.
Yeah.
These plants that you're growing in that, their genes came from parents who are, used to 380 or something.
Yeah.
How do you think it would change if, in an ideal world, you could do an experiment where, like, every generation you ramp up ppms like 20 each time or something?
No, I mean,
in terms
this,
of like
yeah.
down regulation.
Yeah, right. So this goes to the fundamental mechanism, which we think is actually the leakiness associated with photorespiration on the back end of that sugar synthesis, which is conserved across all C3 plants, right? So we think the mechanism we're tweaking is a very basal mechanism on planet Earth. And of course, you see that across life forms that they did, in the FACE experiments and at the lower 550 level. So we don't think we're triggering anything or failing to trigger anything that's a recent evolutionary development, especially because we're seeing it across these very phylogenetically disparate clades, right? So we're potatoes and mustard and Arabidopsis, et cetera. So unless you can come up with a mechanism that would take us to something better in a few generations, I would say that we're not worried about that particular thing.
All right, I have time for one more question, and then if you have other questions, you can, of course, talk to Hope at the social afterwards.
Right, so biomass went up by 100 to 200%, and most minerals went down by about 44%. So I think that gets back to your concentration question.
But just to comment or add to that, then get at his question, they went down 44% per weight. So wasn't it just a consequence of all those minerals getting diluted by more carbohydrates? Mm. And so if the figures you just quoted would say that the total amount of magnesium, the total amount of nitrogen and so forth went up in the plant.
Yes. So a serving, if you're going to say every day I eat a sweet potato, right?
Right.
But from the plant's perspective, for every gram of tissue that it builds, to what extent does it interlace that with protein versus minerals versus sugars? I guess is the interesting thing for me.
I mean, it's just like me eating a whole bunch of bread all day long that's loaded with carbohydrates. I get bulkier, but unfortunately my muscles don't get any bigger.
Exactly. It's not just like that, but that's... Yes, sir.
So I'm not a biologist, so I'm gonna ask a different kind of question. I get your message that rather than extrapolating to what the world's going to be like the next 100 years, we ought to measure, and so your results are very interesting. I'd submit that we're never going to get to that world in that CO2 condition. I mean, in the Mesozoic, the total land area on Earth that was above sea level was probably 50 or 60% of where it is today. You're not going to fit 11 billion people on half the land mass. The world would have blown itself up in other ways. There would be no land between Colorado and Pennsylvania. It would all be underwater. So I'm just wondering, as a matter of, I get the experimental reason why you've done what you've done, but in communicating and getting people's attention, what do you think is a more realistic CO2 level that the world might be facing, recognizing that these other issues, the massive disruption of humanity, which completely destabilizes the planet, is going to stop us well short of these levels, you know, before somehow we're dealing with it? What do you think we do? Because those levels that you mentioned, we're never going to get to that.
Well, that's your opinion, right?
Well,
so
how would you locate 11 billion people in a world? I mean, just take sea level in the Mesozoic. There's no ice on Earth in the Mesozoic, so it's right.
Yeah, well, the entire Mesozoic? No, there was ice during the Cretaceous, but that's another discussion. So I think you do have people that are very committed to this sort of end of days scenario, where something terrible, you know, that something is going to snap, and we're facing really end of days in terms of the number of people and the amount of CO2, et cetera. What I've shown you are the projections that have come out of research institutes. And I've tried to talk rationally about if we have CO2 levels that are this and we have population figures that are this. Now, the details of who's going to live where, and quite frankly, what that's going to do to geopolitical destabilization, warfare, things like that, it's a whole other level of things that can be introduced into this conversation, certainly. I mean, the reason why, and I think it's important to educate students about this, the reason why we have hungry people in the world is not because there's not enough food. It's because we haven't learned how to share, and because war has massively disrupted food distribution cycles in very key parts of the world. Afghanistan is a great example of that. I don't think that I feel as pessimistically as you do about society's ability to flex and sort of grow under these extreme conditions. And I think people were making those kinds of statements certainly in the 1950s when we were approaching sort of the 3 billion mark and the 5 billion mark. I think that's, I think we're getting into the mode of opinion, and I'd certainly be delighted to talk to you about your opinions and my opinions as well. But I think in terms of the classroom in this lecture, I really wanted to stay with, it's hard to talk about food in, you know, people, and then there's the whole thing about food, you know, people have a lot of shame issues around food. Nobody feels like they eat exactly what they should, et cetera. Food is a hard thing to talk about. And so I favor, when I talk in situations like this, I try to talk from a point where everybody can participate and where we can talk as rationally as possible. And I try to tell people my sources and the scenarios under which I'm working. That's basically how I address what you just said.
All right, well, let's